the fact that we now know Neanderthal skeleton interpreted by Marcelian Boole as being bent-kneed, bent hips, shambling, brutish, unintelligent, possibly having a divergent big toe, is actually that of an elderly individual. The first answer. Second, the Levallois stone technology is actually far more sophisticated and difficult to make, and actually more complex, more sophisticated than what was made by anatomically modern humans at the time. Neanderthals mounted large splint spearheads using strong pitch manufactured from birch trees. Or all of these are correct. Who votes for the first answer only? Anybody vote for second answer only? Third answer only? No, it is all of these. Yes. Okay. Which of the following statements about fossilization is not true? Very few once living organisms ended up as fossils. Is that true? That is true. Fossilization can occur, deceased organism covered by sediment, oxygen-free environment. Is that true? That is true. Fossilization can only occur in Africa. Is that true? No, that is not true. So this is our correct answer. Fossils are biological organisms that have partially or wholly been transformed into rock. Right? Which of the following traits is not an indicator of bipedalism in hominids? Broad, short, bowl-shaped pelvis. Is that an indicator of bipedalism? Yes. Significantly increased cranial capacity. Is that an indicator of bipedalism? No. No. Valgus angle at the knee, medially angled femur, and foramen magnum at the base of the cranium. Those are all required for bipedalism. Significantly increased cranial capacity is not necessary, and contrary to what was a long thought about human evolution, an increase in cranial capacity is not what initially drove human evolutionary change. So it was long believed that big brains evolved first, and then bipedalism became the obvious evolutionary change. But instead, bipedalism comes first, and then we get big brains. And actually, the first several million years of our human evolutionary history, going all the way back to Sahelanthropus tchadensis, we are looking at essentially the evolution of bipedalism as an adaptation to life in Africa. Particularly, we have evidence for East Africa and South Africa, but probably across the sub-Saharan African region, right? So bipedalism is the initial step, right? Sorry for the pun, but that's the initial step in the human evolution story. So several million years up through early Homo, evolution is not about brain size. It's not about technology. It's not about cultural complexity. We have no evidence for cultural complexity among Australopithecines. No evidence for social structure, for nuclear families, extended families, the idea that they even lived at like home bases or camps, or even moved across the landscape, probably very much like modern chimpanzees or bonobos today, or even perhaps baboons, right? So this early part of human evolution up through early Homo is all about bipedalism as an adaptation and becoming more and more efficient as a biped. Hominins becoming more and more efficient as a biped. And then, once you have bipedalism, lots of other things start to happen. The hands that have evolved for grasping have the power grip, precision grip. You're able to, like chimpanzees, orangutans, bonobos, and mini monkeys, able to manipulate small objects. You get that precision grip. You're able to manipulate things in the environment. Right? You start to see stone tools. First, they're very coarse, crude, cobblestones with a few flakes knocked off. They probably were used for scavenging bits and pieces of animal protein off of carcasses from other bigger animals' kills. Right? And once we start to see this transition, technology starts to change, right? Starting to see evidence, and there's no reason to believe that, say, Australopithecines weren't using wooden tools, digging sticks for accessing foods below ground and things of that nature, but they just have not survived in the fossil record. Pretty natural that we get stone tools from the fossil record because, as I'm sure you know, stones are pretty resilient, right? They stick around for billions of years. So we have some stone tools starting at about 2.6 million years ago. And this is right about the time we get the transition from the later gracile Australopithecines and the early members of the genus Homo habilis or Homo rudolfensis. And this is right about the time we're starting to see a shift in the nature of human evolution from it being less about bipedalism as an adaptation and the most efficient use of bipedalism and all the benefits that come from bipedalism to a shift towards increasing cranial capacity, which we're going to see in the genus Homo, increasing cranial capacity, which means increasing intelligence, right? Increasing intelligence likely associated with increasing cultural complexity, but which we have little evidence for. Definitely have some with Homo erectus, we'll see, and with archaic Homo sapiens. But we also get significant technological changes. The stone toolkits that are being made and used change significantly, right? But what we tend to see is first a morphological shift, so a shift in the skeletal remains. So morphology changes and we recognize them as a new species, but technology tends to lag, like a lagging indicator. And so it's like these new species uses the old technology for a while, and then we get another shift in technology, and then that technology gets used even through the next speciation, and so on and so forth. Right? So, essentially the first part of human evolution is about bipedalism, and now we're moving into the part of human evolution that is more about increasing cranial capacity, increasing intelligence, changing cognitive abilities, which we see through technology, and ultimately we see through art and other attributes. Right? So we left off talking about Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, and how we have an increase in cranial capacity here, and definitely compared to the Australopithecines, whether we're talking about late surviving gracile Australopithecines or robust Australopithecines, we have a significant increase in cranial capacity, right? Except for 1813. And that is one of those questions, those mysteries in human evolution. But it could, in my mind, be accounted for by variation within a species, or it may mean that we actually have two different species on the landscape at about the same time. A bigger brained species as represented by KNM ER1470, and a smaller brain is represented by KNM ER1813, or as we talked about, it could be sexual dimorphism within the species. Regardless, the big thing here is significant increase in cranial capacity. Using 1470 within, a pretty short period of time, you get a 50% increase, almost 50% increase in cranial capacity. That's a much bigger brain on a body that doesn't look like it's a lot bigger. Right? So, what are the evolutionary trends of early Homo? Well, larger brain size, right? So this is larger brain size, absolutely, and probably represents relative increase in brain size relative to the body, which is how we measure the cephalization quotient. Greater intelligence. We have evidence for tool use, at least the presence of Oldowan stone tools in association with the remains of Homo habilis. Now, we do have in the same layers, like at Oldobai, Australopithecus boisei, Homo habilis, and Oldowan stone tools. The name Oldowan stone tools always makes me think of Obi Kenobi. I'm not saying that right. Obi-Wan Kenobi, that's right. For some reason, Oldowan always makes me think of that, but Oldowan comes from Olduvai Gorge, right? Some people have tried to suggest that Boisei was using the stone tools, but research has shown that they are eating, like we talked about, dry foods, and that their diet stable isotope analysis, which is chemical analysis of bone and teeth, suggests that they were eating a lot of grasses, a heavy grass diet, which would take a lot of processing, chewing, and grinding. And that is not consistent. You don't really need stone tools to process grasses, right? So chances are this bigger brained Homo habilis is responsible for the Oldowan stone tool complex. We also have Australopithecus garhi that may have been using it as well. Remember, it's very simple. And we see dietary and behavioral flexibility. We interpret dietary flexibility from the dentition. The fact that all the teeth are still retained, so incisors, canine, premolars, molars, and the premolars and molars are huge, like we saw in the robust Australopithecines, where you do have dietary specialization, and the anterior teeth are not super small. They're large enough to be useful as nippers and grabbers, like we use them today, like to bite into an apple. So that suggests dietary flexibility. And this behavioral flexibility comes from, again, staying fairly generalized in their overall morphological structure. And this brings us to Homo erectus. Homo erectus was present. Their fossils date from this species, Homo erectus, or attributed to Homo erectus, from 1.8 million years ago to 300,000 years before present. So this is an extremely long-lived species. Homo erectus is first found in East Africa. We'll be going back to some of our old haunts here in East Africa, number of archaeological sites. But then Homo erectus is the first species that we know of to definitively leave Africa. We have Homo erectus finds in the Republic of Georgia and Dominici. We have Homo erectus in Asia, including East Asia and what is now China, as well as Southeast Asia, the Indonesian islands. And also have evidence for Homo erectus in Europe. It is debated because researchers in Europe like to call pretty much anything in Europe something not Homo erectus or whatever the older species is. They always want to make their species the new species that is directly ancestral, more evolved, is what we tend to see. However, there are that. So let's look. Homo erectus in Africa. Several sites that we have seen before. We have Lake Turkana in Kenya, remains as early as 1.8 to 1.6 million years. Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, 1.2 million years. Sites like Bia, Bori, Bodo in Ethiopia, 1 million years ago to 600,000 years ago. So again, we have a number of sites in East Africa where Homo erectus fossils have been found, and we do have sites where we don't have Homo erectus fossils, but we do have archaeological remains that are associated, or believed to be associated with Homo erectus. So this is the earliest that we have Homo erectus is in East Africa, particularly in the Lake Turkana region of Kenya. This is one of the early specimens of Homo erectus. This is KNMER 3733, Kenya National Museum, East Rudolph, or what's now known as Lake Turkana. Dates from about 1.8 million years ago. And you can see this is distinctly different from both the preceding gracile Australopithecines as well as the robust Australopithecines, right? No sagittal crest. You have a nice rounded cranial vault. You notice that it is larger looking. The vault itself looks a lot larger than what we've seen in the preceding Australopithecines and even Homo habilis. We do get fairly large brow ridges, and there is some nice nuchal development, ridge of bone on the back of the vault or the occipital for the attachment of the neck muscles. And these are probably to offset forces acting on the skeleton. Could be things like long distance running, right? You got to hold your head up. It can affect nuchal development, or it could be chewing related, or both, right? It's not exclusive. Very flat face. Right? This is definitely moving in a much more modern human direction. This is a more derived feature, a fairly flat face, and this much larger cranial capacity. So we're going to jump to 736 with 1470 from Homo habilis rudolfensis. Now, with the earliest Homo erectus, we're at 850 cc's. We're getting fairly close to the modern human range for cranial capacity. Right? We also have from Kenya, KNM WT15,000. This is a 1.6 million year old fossil, almost complete. Look how much of that skeleton is present. And it turns out this is a young adolescent, approximately 11-year-old boy, not finished growing. If you look at pictures of him up close, you can see that there are open growth plates at the ends of all the long bones. He had not finished growing, not all his teeth had erupted. He had a cranial capacity at about 900 cc's, which probably would have been his adult cranial capacity. Brains pretty much stopped growing by about time you hit adolescence. You got full brain size by that point. Growth patterns are probably more similar to modern humans based on the eruption of dentition and the correlation of that with the long bones. This individual would, at the time he died, was probably about 5'6", which makes him significantly taller than me. Not that most aren't, but he's already significantly taller than me, and he probably would have been almost 6 feet tall. as an adult. Based on an 11-year-old boy, hasn't gone through puberty yet, it's going to have a growth spurt. So 5'11", 6 foot, that puts him in the human range for height. Look at the arm proportion to the leg proportion. That is human limb proportions, right? The relative length of the arm to the legs, to the trunk. So Homo erectus at 1.6 million years ago is looking an awful lot like, particularly postcranially, like anatomically modern humans. Not exactly like, but very much. Right? The dentition is also becoming more like what we'll see in later Homo sapiens. The molars and premolars are now smaller than Boisei, which is great because those were huge, but also smaller than even Homo habilis or Homo rudolfensis. Whereas the anterior teeth are getting larger. What this suggests is an even more generalized diet, having to maintain all tooth types in proportions that allow you to process all sorts of different foods, fruits, leaves, nuts, berries, meat, things of that nature. Okay? Also means you're not eating a lot of hard-to-chew foods, which may become important later on in this discussion. So Homo erectus heads out of Africa, probably up through the Arabian Peninsula, through the area we now call the Levant, or the Middle East, and into Eastern, what's now considered Eastern Europe. This is site Dominici is in the Republic of Georgia, in the Caucasus region. That's what those mountains are there, the Caucasus Mountains. And here is Georgia. It's actually a fairly small country. And the Dominici finds are actually from underneath a monastery, underneath a medieval monastery, and date to about 1.7 million years ago. So no, I have had people ask me this, Homo erectus not associated with the medieval monastery. It's just sort of how it happens. You find a good place to live, set up camp, and those locations tend to get used over and over and over and over again, both from prehistory all the way through historical times. So this mountaintop was a place where these individuals were located underneath the remains of the monastery. So 1.7, 1.8, they really do date to 1.8. It suggests that Homo erectus probably evolved in Africa a little bit earlier than the earliest fossils that we find. As you can see, we get some different forms, some good sexual dimorphism, at least in terms of degree, with there being some fairly robust males, like the individual on the left, no, the right, that's the right, right? And more gracile individuals, such as the one depicted on the right. Some pretty decent preservation here. However, cranial capacity is smaller. So this is the smallest cranial capacity that we see in Homo erectus. Some have suggested that, like Homo rudolfensis actually, or Homo habilis first immigrated out, and these really belong with the Homo habilis. Don't worry about that. Alternate hypothesis, just know it's a possibility. We don't know everything, and as our understanding is always under revision. But they are there, and they are consistent in many ways with Homo erectus, enough that they get classified as Homo erectus. Homo erectus is also found in Indonesia, the Indonesian islands of Java. There's several sites where we have Homo erectus fossils, and these date from about 1.7 to 300,000 years ago. maybe wondering, how did Homo erectus get to an island like Java? Anybody have any ideas? It would not have been an island at the time, exactly. The Earth was much warmer, cooler at this time, sorry. Much cooler at this time, so much more of the ocean water was locked up in the ice cap around the North Pole and around the South Pole, right? And so ocean levels would have been much, much lower, and all these Indonesian islands would have essentially been connected to what we now think of as mainland Southeast Asia, right? So they walked. So this means that we've got a species on the move 1.7 million years ago. So they have maybe what you want to call wanderlust, the desire to go see, explore, look, find new areas to live, and are moving across the Africa and Asia and Europe, this sort of old world, at a fairly quick pace, right? The original find from Homo erectus was called Java Man. You may see jokes about that sometimes with relation to coffee or something. And that was the find of this skull cap and femur by Eugene Dubois in 1891. He noted the skull cap looked like it could be sort of an archaic human-like form, but he definitely recognized that the femur looked very much like the femur of a bipedal human, an individual like a human, someone who walked like we do. But it has this pathological alteration, and that's where soft tissue has ossified. It's something we see in humans today. It's happened throughout history. But because of that, other people of the time, who again did not want to accept that human evolution, human ancestors could come from anywhere besides Europe, rejected his ideas about these fossils from Indonesia, saying that this was like a gibbon or something of that nature. And Dubois became very unhappy, hid the fossils, and they're not present today, like have not been found. However, we do have more recent finds, like the stuff from Sangaran, where it's clear it's Homo erectus about 800,000 years ago. This particular individual, we can see the brow ridges, the long, low sloping cranial vault, but it is larger cranial capacity. We're at 1,000 cc's with this individual. And again, we can see the dentition, much more human-like than what we saw in the Australopithecines or even Homo habilis. We have Homo erectus in East Asia, particularly from the cave site of Jukutien, which is just outside of Beijing. At 1.2 million years ago to about 300,000 years ago. So there are several sites, but the best known site is Jukutien, and there have been Homo erectus as well as more recent human remains from that site. It's been explored for quite a long time. Here is a reconstruction of the one of the fossils from Jukutien that's attributed to Homo erectus. It was often called Peking man. That is probably not a very appropriate term today, but that was how it was referred to for a very long time in the common literature. It is Jukutien 1, cranial capacity of about 1,100 cc's. You see the attributes of Homo erectus, the larger cranial vault, the big brow ridges, and you can see it from the back. You can see the nuchal development. You do have one of these in lab that you get to look at. And so what we're seeing is across the evolutionary history of Homo erectus is the increasing cranial capacity. Increasing cranial capacity. Then we have evidence from Europe in the form of mostly archaeological remains. So from the site of Boxgrove in England, they have a tibial fragment and an Acheulean hand axe. Acheulean hand axes from about 500,000 years ago would be most likely associated with Homo erectus. But again, there's always debates about stuff from Europe, whether it's really a more primitive form or shouldn't we attribute all this to a more advanced form. So we get that issue with stuff that comes out of Europe. So let's look at the evolutionary trends. So we're getting increasing cranial capacity, right? Admitting that the Davanisci remains are sort of a little bit of an outlier with the smaller cranial capacity, but coming forward from East Africa to Southeast Asia and the Eastern Asian material, we're looking at steadily increasing cranial capacity through time. Steadily increasing cranial capacity through time. We're also seeing increasing tooth size, and this is for all teeth. So again, proportions are maintained. No one tooth type is becoming like huge relative to the others. So we're seeing a generalized diet. Robust skulls with a big brow ridge and the nuchal development, but nothing like we saw with the robust Australopithecine. Not on par with that by a long shot. You also have the long, low cranial vault. So even though we're seeing increasing cranial capacity, you're not seeing the high vaulted crania like anatomically modern humans have today. Postcranial skeleton, we're seeing fully human limb proportions and body size in general, height, and growth patterns are more similar to modern humans than they are to, say, Australopithecine. So we're seeing that shift to a much more modern form, so a much more derived form in Homo erectus. So increasing cranial capacity also is going to be associated with greater intelligence, and with that we also get a more sophisticated toolkit, and that is the Acheulean toolkit. The Acheulean toolkit is characterized by these hand axes, this tear-shaped hand axe compared to an old wand chopper. You can see a clear difference in these two types of tool cultures. To make an Acheulean hand axe, to make that teardrop-shaped tool, you have to have a very clear plan in your mind before you start. You have to have a mental template. How do I do this so it looks like an Acheulean hand axe when I'm done? Not that they knew it was called Acheulean. That's a name we attributed to it. But that's the idea. It takes the cognitive ability to have a mental template to know what your final product is supposed to be, which means you have to learn how to make these tools. And what we see is that regardless of where they're from, whether they're from Africa, whether they're from the Middle East, whether they're from Europe, regardless of the quality of the stone, it's the same pattern over and over and over. So at the bottom here, this is pretty poor quality stone, but it's the same teardrop shape. Here we have a little better quality. So you can see, again, more flakes knocked off over here to make a sharper edge. And this is an even finer stone quality, a nice chert. And this is where you can get some pretty nicely worked material and get some really sharp edges. But regardless, it's all the same shape. It's the same pattern. It is, granted, a relatively simple pattern, but we see it from Africa to Asia to Europe, regardless of material types. So this is the primary tool that we recognize associated with Homo erectus. And they take it with them from Africa and into Asia and Europe. Right? Remember Ologosili, Kenya, 1.5 million years ago? It's a site where we have those hand axes all over the currently exposed ground surface. Right? So this is Ologosili. There are no actual Homo erectus remains here, but there are hand axes aplenty. And again, they're rather crude, but they have that same plan to them, same shape. We also have animal bones. We talked about this before. We have animal bones from Ologosili. And this is an example of an antelope bone, right? Antelope femur from Ologosili that has cut marks on it. And they've done analysis and definitively identified those as cut marks. However, on some of the bones, including this one, the stone tool cut marks overlay tooth marks. So like tooth marks from a leopard or a lion or a hyena. And you can see that this was not really scraping to remove the meat, but was bashing to get access to the marrow on the inside of the bone. So we have evidence for scavenging, but in other areas we have evidence for pretty close to full-on butchering, where they must be getting fairly fresh kill, so maybe they're actually making the kill themselves, and then butchering the animals, making cuts at the joints, slicing meat off the shafts, things of that nature. So suggesting that Homo erectus very early on may have been engaging in scavenging, and soon moved to full-on hunter-gatherer type adaptation, or may have started, or may have done both all throughout their evolutionary history. Looking at animals that hunt, like lions, leopards, things of that nature, they will scavenge when they get the chance, right? You look at scavengers like hyenas, they'll also hunt when they get the chance. So scavenging versus hunting is not an absolute. It's not an absolute in the animal kingdom, so there's no reason why it would be an absolute in humans or these pre-humans, Homo erectus, either. And the idea that they're getting hold of fairly fresh carcasses, maybe it's because they're able to scare off a leopard, right? Sometimes chimpanzees or baboons have been known to scare off a couple of lions, things of that nature. It just depends on how aggressive they're willing to be. And then with those Acheulean hand axes, processing the remains. Now, we also have evidence for the use of fire with Homo erectus. As early as 1.5 million years ago at Kubifora in Kenya, we have burned bone fragments and stone tools. Stone tools actually have burn on them as well. So this suggests the use of fire. You can, with cooking, get more nutrients out of food and make it easier to chew, which means you need less masticatory power. You don't need teeth that are as large in order to process food, right? Also, adding meat to the diet, when the most efficient way to do that, obviously, initially you'd probably be eating it raw, but being able to cook it would make it available to the community, easier to chew. You don't cook it too much, right? And that would make meat more widely available. So the fact that we have Acheulean tools, evidence of scavenging and potentially hunting, definitely butchering, then fire suggests we're moving into sort of a new stage in our evolutionary history. from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa from about 1 million years ago. We have burned bones with Acheulean tools. Again, Acheulean tools are, at this time, 1 million years ago, are going to be associated with Homo erectus. So this, again, suggests cooking. And then at Jakutian Cave in China, burned bones, tools, and ash accumulation consistent with hearths or long-term fireplaces, where it would have suggested basically like areas that were used for cooking, heat production, things of that nature for extended periods of time. So certainly by the time we get to Jakutian, we're looking at controlled, purposeful use of fire on a regular basis in the same location. And you think about it, Homo erectus is leaving nice, balmy, warm Africa and heading into Eastern Europe, heading further east into Asia, you know, the Beijing area in the East Asia. That is a temperate climate. So in order to occupy temperate climates, it makes sense that Homo erectus would have needed to control fire to be able to survive in those types of climates. So, any questions about Homo erectus? Homo erectus, pretty much, brains are getting bigger and technology is advancing. Yes? Okay, so why do we find just one fossil here, one fossil there, one KNMWT 15,000 here? And it's just because of the very specific